Hello, hello, hello. I don't know. Yeah, back at it. Haven't gotten that haircut, right? But I'm here. I'm here. I'm alive, and wherever I am, I suppose ought to be thankful that I can experience my thoughts, right? Something you can't experience. I mean, in other words, like you can experience me telling my thoughts to you, my reflections. It's not really thoughts, right? It's one of those things. That's interesting. I've got several things I want to talk about, not going to be organized. I don't know if I can organize. Part of it, the idea isn't really to organize. It's funny, so much to say. Like, I've got a lot of things to say. The first thing I'll say is that, let me see, what do I say? Let's start with how was my day, right? My day was okay, right? My day was pretty organized, but in other words, there's a sort of self-organization that occurs to the day, right? It's very interesting. But it's also the case that we're starting that new project, which I thought might have taken me, I might have like a lot of changes to the schedule, but not yet. So we're still sort of on standby with all of that stuff. So we'll see. New project's always fun, right? So obviously still doing my client work, but maybe a new project, new opportunities. Always looking for that. But it's interesting because a lot of what I wanted to say, other than that, not much about my day. A lot of what I wanted to talk about a couple of things today. And I'm trying to figure out how to best, first of all, about organization, right? Like the idea was never to organize. And I'll say that, to me, like I've watched YouTube videos, right? It's interesting because I wanna mention YouTube video. We've got a lot to say. I want to try to get it all in, but also like take up the time getting it all in because you want to like sort of boom, boom, boom. Like you sort of go off checklist. I watch YouTube videos that are very organized, and I think they're incredible. It's very much you can sort of see how they're going off of an imaginary outline, right? It's sort of I've got point A. Point A has two subpoints. Subpoint A has two subpoints in its case, right? And it's great, it certainly is, but it's also very formal, right? And the formality aspect can be a little off-putting, right? Like, in other words, like, for me, one of the reasons you don't want to be too organized is because I don't believe conversations are meant to be organized, right? Like, conversations, this is me being whatever. I don't believe conversations are supposed to be about bullet points, right? Like they're supposed to be about sort of just kind of free flow. The idea is to sort of just be like, yeah, like you've got, we're talking about this and then, hey, did you see what Johnny did today? Whatever, right? So it's sort of like a free flow. Now, the point is that I'm making a video talking to an imaginary audience, really my face. And it's sort of like, well, who are you talking to? But it's still, the idea though, is that, the stream of consciousness. The question of the day. I was debating what questions of the day. The question of the day is how organized is your stream of consciousness, right? Like how organized are your thoughts in general, right? That's interesting. That is an interesting question. I don't believe that my thoughts are necessarily disorganized. And like I said, I want to caveat that point because that's really what I wanted to talk about, the main point. We're still going to stop at 10 minutes. I'm not going to go any further, but I don't know if I'll get to it because I want to get some other stuff. I've never been of the opinion that my thoughts are necessarily disorganized. I think they come out, right? Because the reason they come out is because I'll say something and then I'll think of something else, right? And it's sort of like, oh, like this leads to this leads to that, right? And I suppose that's sort of like how, because I'm receiving stuff and I'm always like thinking about it. And there's sort of this natural nervousness, right? But then there's also the idea of like, oh, this reminds me of this. And so I'm going to, sort of caveat all over the place. The point is that like, all of that to say that, but it is interesting because question of the day, like how organized are your thoughts? And so, it's very interesting because while my thoughts are not unorganized, right? I believe my behavior or my thoughts might come out organized. My behavior is not, right? And so this really gets to the main point that we were going to talk about. First, another point that I'll mention, right? I was talking about how the idea of what are these really? These are really just like sort of reflections, right? When I ask you like, how did your day go? And you talk about your day, you're really just reflecting on the day, right? And that's what this has always been about, right? 511 reflections. But I believe, right, and this is another point, this is another question. The difference between thoughts and reflections, I believe that when people truly say thought or thinking, they really refer to a judgment, right? So they're saying, I don't even know what would be an example. I judge the, so for example, like the understanding, like for example, like you see a car, and you know the car is a Mustang or a sort of Chevy Camaro, right? And you got to know the difference between the two. The two, they used to be very different, right? Like remember, like in the '90s, the Mustang was. How did the Mustang look in the '90s? The '80s Mustang almost looked like it wasn't very sporty at all, right? And I think the '90s Mustang. I'm trying to think of what the '90s Mustang looked like. It was boxy. Like the '80s Mustang was pretty boxy, but remember the Camaro was not. The Camaro started out boxy, but then it went to very curved, right? And then remember the Pontiac Firebird. That was always my favorite because that was really curved. I always liked the aerodynamics, right? It's very interesting. The point is that now they look similar. Now they're very the muscle car came back. Like I don't know when it came back, right? But now it's like sort of all muscle cars, and they do look similar. I mean, in my opinion, my naive opinion, but it's sort of like, but that's a judgment, right? The judgment is to say, no, these indicators are these indicators indicate, Mustang. Obviously, if you see a Ford sign versus a Chevy sign, right? But what am I saying that for? Because when we think about thoughts, though, we think about sort of. We don't necessarily just I believe the colloquial definition of thoughts is kind of just whatever's on your mind. And what is on your mind most of the time is not, I believe this to be a Chevy Camaro, I believe this to be a Mustang, or I know this to be a Chevy Camaro, I know this to be a Mustang. I believe what is actually on your mind is like, oh, I wonder if Jenny likes me, like, can I ask Jenny out, right? Like, oh, I'm thinking about what I did yesterday. Oh, did I say the right thing to Johnny? Or, oh, what should I do? What should I eat for dinner tonight, right? Like, that's a judgment, but it's sort of like, these are all your thoughts, right? And so it's interesting, like, what do we call them, right? Now, I'm sure there's a dictionary definition, but the point is that, like, our understanding of words is basically like you can rely upon a sort of colloquial understanding of words. And then you sort of look for the dictionary definition, and that's a more precise definition, but that's a purely external thing. You pick up your understanding subjectively in terms of however you acquire the concept, right? And so for me, it's thoughts, right? Now, is this actually reflections? Well, that depends on your definitions of thoughts or reflections. And so anytime we make a judgment, we can either make the judgment in accordance with our subjective determination of things, right? Our subjective understanding of things, or we can make it with respect to some external understanding of things. Now, let's consider this example, though. The idea of mental imagery, right? So, do you have mental imagery or not? That's a very sort of, there's an objectively correct answer to that, right? So, in other words, like, I believe, like I've said this before, this is something that fascinates me because when I first heard about people who don't have or claim not to have mental imagery, I was very confused. Now I will say, like, when I try to imagine things, I think of concrete things, right? And I know that there's a book called Thinking in Pictures, right? And this lady, like, it's interesting. I didn't get to all my points. We're almost out of time. But this is interesting. This stuff it really does. I'm honestly very intrigued by this stuff. Anyway, so the lady was talking about how she thinks, like, if you Google, right, Google is the final authority on everything, right? I'm just kidding. But if you Google thinking in pictures, I can't remember the lady's name, but there's a book and it's about thinking in pictures, and I've watched it a little. There's a TED Talks that she talks to us too. Like I said, I don't know the backstory. I don't know, like, if she's whatever. All I can say is I heard her say stuff and I related to it, because when I think of things, like when I think of a Chevy Camaro, right, I'll try to form the picture of the Camaro, right? And that's why I was trying to think of a 90s Mustang. And I believe the 90s Mustang is a sort of evolved version of the 80s. I know the 80s, like there's a Chevy Cavalier. I'm not comparing a Mustang to a Chevy Cavalier, right? But they are like, there was a boxy 80s Mustang, if I remember it correctly, right? If I'm envisioning it correctly, there was an 80s Mustang, and then there was like a sort of the Cavalier, and the Cavalier's boxy, because the boxy cars to me are not sexy, right? Like, you need curves. I mean, not that you don't need curves, right? Like, you could certainly be fine without curves, but curves are not bad. I'll just say that, right? That's our objectively correct assessment. And let me just say one other thing, right? Because I believe in there's a subjectivity and a relativity, but there's also objectively correct facts, right? So, for example, the big mystery of the day, whether the Earth is flat or not, right? And it's funny because, and I'm going back to this. We're going over whether the Earth is flat or not, right? Is a question of fact, and it's a question of objective fact. And so the judgment, you can have a subjective opinion about it, but it is because it is in the outside world observable. It is a sort of objectively correct fact. I would also argue that the same applies to sort of mixing up a Mustang and a Camaro, right? So there's a difference, but thoughts, right? Because thoughts is like a pure concept. I don't believe, like, in other words, like, it's sort of definable, right? And you can correlate it to the thing, right? And so I guess in a way you can say, well, that's what makes a Mustang Mustang? Well, if it says Mustang on it, I don't know. It's interesting. There's sort of a purely concrete association. I don't know what I'm doing. The point is, this is an interesting story. We'll pick back up. I didn't even get to my main point. This is what a day, right? Anyway, it was a good talk, and hope everybody's doing well. Super drop Thursday, and yeah, it's interesting. Another day in paradise. Have a good one, guys. Take care.